You are about to watch the moment a WNBA superstar stopped smiling for the cameras and finally said what everybody had been thinking for weeks. Stay with me until the end, because what happens after this argument is even bigger than the argument itself, and I promise you, the last part of this video will change how you see this entire season. Before we go further, hit subscribe right now, because this story is still developing and you do not want to miss what comes next. Let's start with the number that started all of this: 210 seconds. That is how long Caitlin Clark was allowed to stay on the floor before her own head coach pulled her out of a game she was dominating. It happened against the Portland Fire. Indiana came out of the gate hot. Clark ran the offense like a metronome, picked up 3 assists in the opening minutes, and helped push the Fever to an 8-4 lead. The building had that electric hum you only get when a superstar is heating up in real time. And then, at the 6:30 mark of the first quarter, Stephanie White made a substitution that would define the entire week of headlines that followed. Clark was pulled, so was Aaliyah Boston, so was Lexi Hull. What happened next was almost too predictable. Portland went on a 13-2 run the moment Clark hit the bench. By the time she checked back in with 3:38 left in the first, the damage was already done. That run eventually stretched to 27-7. The Fever never recovered. Final score: 100-84, Portland. Indiana's second straight loss. Now here's where it gets interesting, because after the game, reporters wanted answers, and Stephanie White gave one that a lot of people did not expect. She said the substitution wasn't some new experiment. She called it their normal pattern, explaining that Aaliyah Boston was still working under a minutes restriction, and that Clark typically comes out around the same point. She even referenced a different game, in Golden State, where she didn't make that same substitution because she didn't want a rookie ball handler out there alone. On paper, that's a coach explaining rotation logic. But the numbers told a different story. When analysts pulled the data on Clark's first quarter substitution times across the season, this game marked the earliest she had been pulled all year, 3 minutes and 30 seconds in. So when White called it typical, the tape didn't fully back her up. And that gap between what was said and what actually happened is exactly what lit the fuse for everything that followed. Stick around, because in a few minutes I'm going to break down the actual sideline confrontation between Clark and White that went viral, and what Clark herself said about it afterward might surprise you. Let's rewind a little further, because this wasn't a one-game story. It was building for weeks. Clark had missed time with a back injury after a hard foul during a game against the Phoenix Mercury. A play so rough that the league retroactively upgraded it to a flagrant foul. When she finally returned to the lineup after 2 weeks out, everyone expected a careful, structured comeback. What they got instead was something stranger. Her stints on the floor against the LA Sparks looked almost randomized. 3 minutes here, 2 minutes there, a minute and a half, then back out. Over 6 separate stretches, her longest uninterrupted run on the court was 3 minutes and 15 seconds. She finished that game with only 9 points and a -16 plus-minus in just 16 total minutes of action, and Clark did not stay quiet about it. After that game, she was blunt with reporters. She said flatly that the plan wasn't her decision. She also said something that stuck with a lot of fans, that going in for 3 minutes, coming out, going back in for 3 more, made it almost impossible to find any rhythm at all. Coach White had her own explanation, and to be fair, it wasn't unreasonable on its face. She described it as a genuinely difficult situation, pointing out that any player coming back from a couple of weeks away needs time to rebuild endurance and get reacclimated to the pace of the game. Here's the problem. Clark's own comments about her body didn't exactly match that explanation. She said herself that physically she felt great. That was the one positive she could take from an otherwise rough return. So you had 2 different explanations floating around at the same time, one about conditioning and one from the player herself saying conditioning wasn't really the issue. If you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into. Real quotes, Real box scores, no fake drama. Subscribe now so you don't miss where this goes. Now let's get to the moment everybody has been talking about, the sideline exchange. During a second quarter timeout in that Portland game, cameras caught Clark and White in a heated back and forth. Nobody outside that circle knows exactly what was said in the moment. What we do know is what happened right after. White substituted Clark out of the game for rookie Raven Johnson. Clark got up off the bench, visibly frustrated, shaking her head as the exchange kept going. The clip spread everywhere within minutes. Now, if this were the kind of channel that just wants to feed you outrage, this is where we'd tell you it was a full-blown blow-up, a total institutional meltdown. But here's the thing. Clark herself addressed it directly, and she downplayed it. She described it as two competitive people who both want to win, and said things like that happen all the time between teammates and coaches, camera or no camera. That's a very different tone than the explosive framing you might see elsewhere. And that contrast, a genuinely tense viral moment on one hand and a controlled, almost dismissive response from the player at the center of it on the other is honestly the most revealing part of this whole story. It tells you Clark is choosing her battles publicly, even while the frustration underneath is clearly real. But not everyone was as calm about it. WNBA analyst Jason Whitlock went further than almost anyone in the media, publicly accusing White and Fever assistant coach Brianne January of deliberately sabotaging Clark with that early substitution. He argued that no superstar in the history of the sport gets pulled after just 3.5 minutes of excellent playmaking, and that the disruption of her rhythm was intentional. That is a strong claim, and it's important to say clearly, that's Whitlock's opinion and interpretation. It is not a confirmed fact, and Clark herself never used the word sabotage about her own coach. But the fact that a national analyst was willing to say that on the record tells you how far this story had already traveled beyond just basketball strategy. We're not even at the most important part yet. Coming up, I'll show you exactly what other analysts noticed in the substitution data, and why one WNBA insider said this pattern made her wonder about something nobody else had brought up publicly. Keep watching. Let's talk about Khristina Williams, a respected WNBA analyst who broke down the substitution pattern from a completely different angle. She pointed out that Clark, the player who was clearly the hot hand in that first quarter, was the one being pulled at the 3-minute mark. Her read was that subbing out your hottest player that early, up on the scoreboard, felt soft as a coaching decision. She also raised the possibility that the pattern reflected ongoing concern about Clark's health and recovery, rather than pure strategy. That's a fair and grounded take, and it matters because it's coming from someone who evaluates basketball for a living, not just someone reacting emotionally to a viral clip. So, where does that leave us? On one side, you have a head coach explaining a substitution pattern as standard procedure tied to injury recovery and minutes restrictions. On the other, you have box score data suggesting this was actually an outlier compared to the rest of the season. In the middle, you have the player everyone came to watch saying publicly that the plan wasn't hers, that her body felt fine, and that it was hard to find rhythm in 3-minute bursts, while also refusing to turn a heated sideline moment into a full-blown public war with her coach. That tension is the real story here, and it's a legitimate one because it goes straight to the biggest question hanging over this entire Fever season. How do you build a system around the most talked about player in the sport's history, while also managing her recovery from a real injury, without those two goals working against each other on national television? There's no clean villain in this story, and honestly, that's what makes it worth paying attention to instead of just another hot take cycle. It's a coach trying to manage a fragile return from injury under enormous public pressure. It's a superstar who is honest about her frustration, but disciplined enough not to blow it up publicly. And it's a fan base and media ecosystem watching every single substitution like it's a referendum on the franchise's entire direction. What happens next matters more than what already happened. Does White adjust the rotation pattern going forward? Does Clark's tone shift if the losses keep piling up? Does another moment like that sideline exchange happen again? And if it does either side stay this controlled about it? If you want to be here when the next chapter of this story breaks, because it will, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and drop in the comments whether you think this was really about conditioning or about something the front office isn't saying out loud yet. I read every single one. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.